So we'll move on to Andrew. Andrew, if you have a question, please go ahead. And then we'll take one trip if he reconnects. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi all, thanks for the panel today. I'm curious about your thoughts on the role of decentralized data storage facilities. So like Web 2 would have centralized physical locations where data is stored. In Web 3 with decentralized storage, does a version of that exist, or is it all peer-to-peer?
I'm happy to take this. In my experience, strict peer-to-peer doesn't work in most cases because people are not always online. So unless your data is super popular, not everyone will have it. You need to basically pay someone somewhere to actually keep your data. The key part about decentralized systems is that instead of only paying a specific party using a custom protocol or a custom API, you would use a general purpose API to pay someone through some kind of marketplace, ideally. Or at least using a protocol so you can switch providers easily.
Thanks. Let's move on to Why Are You Sleeping? Please go ahead.
There we go, Mike. Hey, I'm Y. I work on IPFS and Filecoin and a number of other related things. And I'm mostly just curious what people think about what do you actually want persisted in a social network? Like you make these posts and you have a lot of stuff and metadata associated with a social network. And sometimes it makes sense to be part of the public record, but sometimes it doesn't. And what do we actually think is the right persistent story here, or even the right UX for a persistent story?
Interesting question. I mean, obviously, you're going to want to have any of your public stuff persisted. So if we're doing the Twitter analogy, your tweets, depending on the design, probably your follows, your likes, things like that. So you can, any kind of public activity, I think that pretty clearly contains the full set.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing comes in though when you have the ability to persist things more permanently. You have content addressing, you put things on a blockchain, and now once you've done that, you kind of lose the ability to delete things. Whereas if you're doing more of a soft, say it's just on IPFS, but it's not really persisted anywhere in particular, the ability to delete becomes a little easier. But once it's thrown onto something more of a permanent substrate, then this is how people use the the Internet Archive. When they want something to not be deleted off Twitter, they go to the Internet Archive and they snapshot it. But that almost feels adversarial in some respects. Not sure.
Yeah.
If you don't have the right to be forgotten, there's going to be problems in the world, especially as governments move towards more authoritarian behavior. So I don't think we should be using any decentralized protocol that does not support that secure delete ability that we discussed at the beginning of the panel.
Yeah, but secure delete is impossible from a information theory perspective.
That's true for centralized systems as well, but it doesn't mean the protocols, as I explained earlier, can't use Martin Kleppmann's and other people's CRDTs to efficiently delete where it is possible.
I guess it's kind of just shifting the problem, but that's...
Yeah, usually I find that there's a few easy cases. There are some things that you want to save forever. If somebody has done something abusive and you put them on a block list, you probably want to remember the fact that they did a thing that got them on a block list. You don't want that to just time out and go away and now they're forgiven. There are a lot of things that you want to be ephemeral, and there's a lot of different applications that have made real value out of saying this is an ephemeral thing and it's going to be around for a short period of time and then it's going to all go away. Most of the content falls into this weird liminal space of, I don't care how long this is stored. I'm not willing to keep paying to store it. I'm not willing to pay you to spend cycles deleting it. Let's just let it live as long as someone is interested in keeping it around. And those tend to be much trickier of the, what do I do with things that are not, I clearly want this to be ephemeral and then go away, or I clearly want this to live forever, but the I want this to live until I delete it, or the I want this to live until people get bored and stop making copies of it.
Let's move on to Haddock Capital. Please state your question, Haddock Capital.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to chime in on something someone just said recently. So they said that, with the rise of authoritarian governments, you might not want permanent storage. And it seems to potentially be the opposite. We noticed with Hong Kong, I think there was that newspaper that had data, and an individual at that company, when I guess the company was being raided, they took all the data and they stored it permanently online on Arweave. And that seems like, something you might want, right? Definitely in certain cases you don't want it, but in that particular case you would want it, and you can understand ways in which you might want permanent storage. No?
Yeah, I absolutely want to agree with what Haddock said. I think people have absolutely the wrong idea about the threat from authoritarian governments. It's not that they will find the one little piece of data that they need to find. It's that they're controlling the overall information flow, and they're controlling the mass of people, what they see. They're much more interested in massive disinformation than they are in finding that one little piece of information. And the reality is they're not going to find it anyway by encryption. They're going to find the data by stopping the person on the street and forcing them to open up their cell phone, which they have the password to do. So I think that the challenge against authoritarian governments is different than what we've been thinking.
Well said.
Okay, let's please move to Prachi Renati. Please state your question.
If
And we'll
I
put
can, while I'm
David's-
interrupting the talk, I have a question. Regarding trust versus trustless, I noticed that people are assuming that once we're decentralized, that now we're going to be trustless. But I think Aaron could probably speak to this, and Paul Frazee as well, that in these huge organizations, you really don't have a completely trusted situation. You do have bad actors even within the organizations. It's almost like we've been trying to say that, oh, well, if a person is hired by an organization, therefore they enter the trusted circle. But if we don't have people being hired by organizations, we can't possibly have trust. And I think that's a little bit of an assumption. I think that it's possible for there to be circles of trust and federated agreements, whether or not there happens to be a corporate stock owner of that federated system. And I'm wondering if anyone would like to speak to that.
I think a lot of that comes down to the values of communities. So if you ask the question, who controls the Linux kernel? It's a little bit fuzzy. There's not like one company that controls the whole thing, and lots of different people have different forks. But I still feel safe using Linux because I'm generally trusting that the community is vetting the commits that come in and how things are changing. Each community is going to have to figure out what are their own standards and who are the people we want to trust. And it's true, there are bad actors at Twitter and Facebook and Google, and those companies go to a lot of effort to try and make sure they have principle of least privilege internally and people can't cause unlimited amounts of damage. Whether your community is a corporation or a social network group or a Facebook page group, like there's always going to be this question of what are the community norms for your community, and does the network give you the tools you need to enforce those norms?
That's a very good answer, and I'll let everybody else talk now. But I think that just speaking from being one of the moderators in the Bluesky community, I'm hoping that in future discussions, maybe we'll start even discussing what some of those norms could possibly be, and what would that look like to have norms across a decentralized community.
Yeah, I'll just add that the really interesting thing that trustlessness does is help us collaborate with each other. That's kind of the ultimate goal. Bandwidth sharing is such a good example of that. Being able to have multiple people acting as a host for data without having any previous relationship with each other, that's about enabling collaboration on this task of hosting information. So it's kind of funny and counterintuitive that when we talk about trustlessness, some folks will take that as like, oh, we don't trust anybody anymore. That's not cool. But the reality is it's kind of quite the opposite. It's about creating commons. It's about enabling collaboration between strangers. And I That's I don't know how well that answers your question, but that's what I wanted to toss out on the topic.
Right. I think the assumption is that if it's something's completely trustless, that you have to sort of encode it in sort of an enforced way with an incentivization. And I think maybe that's what I'm getting about, is that maybe it's more a matter of reputation than some kind of incentivized forcing. But yeah.
Yeah, and that will almost certainly, reputation will show up at some part of this layer at some stage.
Thank you, Golda, Paul, Aaron. Let's now move to David Su. David?
Yeah, hey, thanks for taking my question. So my question is more regarding like, how do you guys deal with kind of like content that is either obtained illegally or is against sort of like regulation or just whatever rules that is kind of like being stored on, I guess, like decentralized storage, and how do you guys just kind of like what's the thinking around that?
One quick thing I want to remind people about this illegal content is that Bitcoin, which a lot of people reference, does not actually store the data itself. It's the hash tree. So it's very easy for a Bitcoin miner or operator to actually prune or delete the actual illegal content while still preserving the chain history because of the Merkle hash. Really, it only needs the hashes, not the actual data set.
David, does that answer your question?
Yeah, sort of. So you're just saying that like miners would just kind of like go and prune like the hash on a I guess like how do you know that certain hashes are of certain things?
Aaron, do you want to answer how Apple does it with the CSAM, I think, approach?
Yeah, so they're basically doing it with a fingerprinting challenge. I am going to develop some kind of system that says I recognize a bunch of really bad content that is illegal or copyrighted or whatever, and make a bunch of fuzzy hash fingerprints that now, when you scan the data, you can say, this matches this thing that shouldn't be stored. So one half is, how do we distribute these lists, and how do you agree on these lists and decide which ones to follow? So maybe the EU publishes one list and the US Trademark Office publishes another list. And depending on the jurisdictions in which you want to operate, you follow all the laws in the jurisdictions in which you want to operate. And the flip side of that is the sort of mathematics of how hash things tend to work, in which you can say, depending on how I've made my structure, I could keep around hashes that show, I can prove if you give me the content, this is the content that was there. I say I deleted the thing with this hash, but because I deleted it, I'm no longer storing the actual illegal bytes themselves. And there's a bunch of research, if you look for it, on redactable data structures, where if the data is there, you can prove the data is exactly what the data was at some earlier time. But if the data is not there, well, you don't have it. People talk about a hash as referring to something that is immutable, but it's actually slightly more accurate to call it semi-immutable, because there's two possible states. It was exactly this data, or I don't know.
Thank you, Aaron. Madi Mozaffari, would you like to ask your question? Please go ahead.
Hello. At first, I'm sorry for my bad English. My question is, in cloud storage like Google Cloud, just Google and user have a copy of data that he upload. But in decentralized storage, everyone have a copy of user data and maybe access to data. So when a user delete his data, maybe someone that run a node have a copy of data. Okay, so maybe one day he access to my private key or other. way that access to my private data, because I think I deleted my data, but they not have a copy of them. Okay. So what is your solution for this problem?
Thank you, Madi.
I'm not entirely sure if I understand your question, but I believe the general solution is encryption. You make sure you encrypt your data so that people find the data later. They can't decrypt it. That, of course, puts the problem down into managing the keys. So the best solution for that right now is hardware keys. But then if you lose them, then you lose your data. So this is really kind of an unsolved problem space.
But we can upload our data to Google Cloud with key, okay, with encryption mode. My question is, I think when I delete my data from decentralized storage, okay, but someone that have a node copy of my data, okay.
Yeah. So the basically the answer is there's really nothing you can do with this secure delete problem, where if someone has a copy of our data, you can't force them to delete it. They can't even prove that they deleted it. The best you could do is make it so they couldn't read the data in the first place by encrypting it. That's really all you can do.
Yeah, and I think that's not a decentralized storage specific problem.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madi. The floor for questions is open. Our panelists do have answers. Please request to speak, and we'll add you to the question queue.
We can't promise you they're the right answers, though.
I was just going to say.
Robert, I think we will have to take a few people off stage to add more people, but the max capacity is 10.
Thanks. So we've just added Superbolic. Could you state your question?
Hey guys, I'm kind of late, so I don't know. I joined late. I don't know if you talked about this already, but I was curious if, since Jack's stepped down from Twitter, has the vision of what this is going to be changed at all, and is it going more towards blockchains and less towards just like decentralized technology?
Jay?
Could be Jay or Golda.
Hey, I had trouble unmuting myself. So we learned about Jack stepping down at the same time as everyone else, but basically Parag has been working with the Bluesky community since it originally started in the Matrix chat room, and so it hasn't changed any plans drastically for us.
So I guess like I when it was announced back in January, I was pretty excited about it because it seemed like it'd be such a good solution to the censorship, and be able to take Twitter out of the role of having to do censorship, because nobody wants to do censorship. But then like I was looking through the Bluesky Twitter account back then, and it was like lots of retweets from crypto companies and founders of altcoins and stuff. And I was wondering, like, is this going towards like using Ethereum or something like that, or like what's the future of Bluesky? Is it going to be completely integrated with crypto blockchains, or is it going to be more like what TBD is trying to do, where they're just trying to prove out you don't need tokens, you don't need blockchains, you can just do decentralized technology?
Thanks.
As one member,
I was going to say we're blockchain agnostic. That space is evolving a lot, and I think the fundamental tech here is, having cryptographic user identifiers. And so, if we can support that in more platforms and make it interoperable, I think that'll open up a lot of blockchain use cases. But we're not necessarily going to choose and try to pick winners here.
I think the important thing to remember is that blockchains are just tools like anything else, and they can be used for decentralization, but it's not like a project has to become a blockchain project or anything like that.
Yeah. Also, I want to point out that there were people from Solid, from TBL's project, and for folks listening, that's Tim Berners-Lee, I'm sure you're referring to, who are involved in the Bluesky space. They may not be super active right now, but we do consider Solid part of the ecosystem.
And as just one person in the community, my personal preference is I hope to stay away from blockchain stuff, but that's just my view.
From the panelists, any other comments with regards to that?
One thing I might add is that if you're interested in non-blockchain things that have some of the capabilities but don't use things like proof of work or proof of stake, holochain is pretty interesting. And there's a lot of, it's just a really dynamic space. I hang out with a lot of people that consider themselves Web3 folks. And it's always been interesting to see how quickly they're moving. And I really can't put down any solid bet about where this is headed. So I know there's a lot of pushback against blockchains right now for very understandable reasons. I have been doing that myself for quite some time. But I wouldn't necessarily write off what's going on in Web3 as much as I think a lot of people are, because I don't think this is quite as straightforward as this is all crypto and this is all coins and pumps on coins and things like that. I think the space is actually a little more dynamic, and I'd sort of welcome people to reserve judgment a little bit while this is still moving like it is.
Thank you, Paul. Up next will be Abu Baker Omer, and we'll put Mark on deck as well as Kavion. Go ahead, Abu Bakr.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a follow-up to the very first question, which is, since peer-to-peer doesn't seem to be the way for storage, and facility storage will be most likely where most of the data is stored, is there any strategies or protocols to prevent centralization from happening again? Because most likely you'll have power users when it comes to the facility storage space.
Thank you, Abu Baker.
I'm happy to answer this one, actually. I think the key part here are protocols. So when you start building general purpose protocols for storing data, for paying for storage, that kind of stuff, then you make it harder to centralize. What happens with centralization is like you have some group that gets you as a customer, and they start adding features to the protocols and basically kind of lock in, because it becomes very expensive to move. If you have standardized protocols where everyone just uses the same protocols, then it's very easy to move. So it becomes more about the marketplace and more about competition and less about like, well, I'm stuck with this provider.
Thank you, Stephen Allen. Let's now move to question from Kavion. You're on the air, and then we'll move
Robert,
to Bart.
Ian wanted to say something, but he got disconnected.
Please go ahead, Ian, and then we'll move on to the next questionnaire. Go ahead, Ian.
So he got disconnected. Ian wanted to state, Ian is the founder of Peergos. He wanted to state this, quote, I was going to say, on the privacy side, you should ideally have a defense in depth. Don't rely solely on encryption to work forever. So you need access control independent of the encryption, i.e. stop people who are not authorized from even getting the encrypted text, the ciphertext. That was Ian.
Thanks, Mark and Ian. Kayvon, would you like to ask your question?
Hi there. This is Kayvon. I'm a co-founder of another company named Functionland. The question I had for you was specifically about the blockchain subject that was brought up earlier. So in a world that it is not blockchain connected, our storages, how do we see alternatives to cloud services like backups or joining forces on compute to solve like an AI algorithm in a cluster of computers as opposed to a single one? And what would the incentive be? And the point being that maybe blockchain can provide that kind of functionalities.
So a good thing to remember is that organizations and companies and even governments can still participate in decentralized protocols. Same thing with blockchain. So you might run a Bitcoin miner by yourself. That's pretty hard these days. But Amazon is able to spin up Bitcoin miners on their hardware. That's also true for decentralized protocols. I do agree with you, actually, that the more original BitTorrent style or my style with gun, that what's kind of called DWeb, is on a more volunteer basis. And that's going to largely be determined based off of your social network. So I might store data for a friend of a friend, even if I'm not getting paid for it. As soon as you're outside of that friend of a friend kind of volunteer type basis, yes, there's certainly a marketplace where traditional forms of payment or blockchain come in and take over. So you're absolutely right. There's still an area for that.
I strongly agree about that. And one of the ways that I like to try to shrink the concept around blockchains is just to remember it's a way to do per transaction compute. So if you're able to send a payment along with a request to do compute, you're copying a significant portion of what blockchains accomplish when it comes to this question of having decentralized compute. The other thing it adds in is a kind of a verification that the compute is working correctly. For instance, with smart contracts, the compute is bound by those contracts and can be audited from the outside. So if you break down the pieces of what blockchains are trying to accomplish but don't want to use a blockchain, it should be doable to reproduce a lot of this behavior if you're able to handle the payment side as well as that kind of auditable transaction side.
Yeah, I think the key part there really is the payment side, where like that is the thing that blockchains provide. There are other ways of doing this, but no one really knows of a good decentralized way to do it. It's not blockchains. But once you have solved the payment side, then yeah, you can just have basically fully decentralized marketplaces where people can like pay for some service, like compute, and they verify it themselves. They can pay for retrieval, and it's just like you just publish to everyone, hey, I want this thing, and they give it to you, and then you pay them. So you don't actually need blockchains for a lot of this stuff.
The way I like to think about it is that DWeb protocols will replace the top 100 most popular websites, hopefully. YouTube, Twitter, social media. And blockchain is really case specific to replacing banks or financial transactions. Blockchains claiming to do everything else is extremely difficult.
I actually just strongly disagree with that. So blockchains deal with agreement. They get people to publicly agree on something based on some set of rules. So like banks are one of them where everyone needs to agree on who has what funds. But there are other cases where you actually do need people to publicly agree that something has happened in some order. But that is the use case.
I think there's one issue with the blockchain incentive structure when you're talking about disinformation, which is that often there's a huge real world incentive to provide the disinformation, which could override any of the actual value stored in the blockchain. So often the bad actors have a huge amount of resources that could really completely overpower the network. And so I think the assumptions that blockchain makes about the incentivized structure for secure information don't apply if there's a large amount of off-chain value that's just much, much larger order of magnitude than whatever is on-chain. But they want the information to act as if it's real.
Stephen, I actually agree with Paul a lot, as a lot of the agreement can be done with cryptographic signatures in a decentralized network without the need for a blockchain.
Yes. Absolutely, yeah. No, if it's just between a group of people, it's when you have basically an open group of people. When the members are not preset, that's when you really need a blockchain. If you have a closed group of people, yeah, you just get everyone to sign it, you're done.
We have 7 more in line for questions, so let's see if we can take all 7 of these. Let's go to Mark Andrew next, and Ali Jr. will be on deck, followed by Aria. So Mark Andrew, please state your question. Go ahead.
Hi there. First of all, thank you. You guys are a wealth of knowledge and expertise. I'm very new to this field, and I dropped into the call late. But question is, how far away do you think we are to commercial products of DIDs, which could be set up at home for consumers to buy, whether that be through Square or Microsoft or Bluesky or whoever, where I, as a consumer, could have my own DID at home and use that as part of this whole decentralized identity and decentralization in general, if it's possible to speak to that. Thank you.
DIDs have been promised for a long time, and from my perspective, I think it's going to be a long time before we see stuff, but I may be wrong. I'm always hearing them stating it's around the corner.
Yeah, not to sidetrack it, but the W3C draft got a negative vote from the Mozilla folks. So does anybody know how much that impacted the progress of DIDs?
Maybe we could take a quick panel vote to see how many here on the panel actually like DIDs. I do not think it's a good scenario.
Well, they're sort of a placeholder solution. I mean, I think in a lot of I get why they were formed, because people were working on multiple different protocols, multiple different blockchains, and there's obviously some need for a identifier specification that can encompass all of that. And so I get why DIDs were put together. They had to have something to do these references. But I do agree that their uptake has been pretty slow, and I'm not entirely sure whether or not they're a good bet in the long run.
Yeah, I think DIDs are useful as a higher level abstraction to, like Paul said, encompass all of these different standards that are evolving together at the same time. And it's, when you're uncertain of what standard is going to pan out in the long run, you don't really want to pick just one format or one ledger. You want to have embedded in your naming system a higher level abstraction that lets you upgrade. So I think that's a very useful part of it. But as for actual adoption, I think it really comes down to rough consensus and working code. And so I think this just depends on how fast we can get there when there's a lot of entities involved that might, take a long time to adopt things. And it really takes a long time to move forward standards. So maybe I think if we find the killer app, implementations might move ahead before standards fully solidify sometimes.
Thank you, Jay. Let's move to Ali Jr.'s question, and Aria will be on deck. Go ahead, Ali Jr., if you're there. Ali, it looks like you might have some issues with connecting. Please try again. We'll move to Aria. Please go ahead with your question. Take about 1 minute at the most, and go ahead.
Hi, so my question is basically, we all agree that decentralized storage is not going to be P2P. So in case of storage facilities that actually provide the storage, how are we ensuring in the current protocols that there is no centralization in these storage facilities that are being... So how are we ensuring that a certain storage facility doesn't take over a lot of the data on the network?
So I don't know if this is going to be an unpopular opinion in this particular room, but I don't necessarily see the goal as preventing one centralized entity from doing a lot of the storage. If you have a protocol that essentially holds an auction for where everything gets stored, and the storage happens at the place that is the highest performance for the lowest price, then you're going to get to a world where chances are the data centers are going to do most of the storing because they're 1,000,000 times bigger and 1,000 times cheaper than anything you can do from your home on your commercial internet connection. My goal is instead to have the protocols designed in such a way that you own your data and you can move out of those storage facilities very cheaply, very easily, very seamlessly, which will move the sort of Nash equilibrium of the behavior of the storage to behave well. Because if a particular storage provider, even if they have 90% of the market, starts behaving badly, they're going to lose market share and everyone will be able to shift over without having to rewrite their applications or fundamentally rethink their data architecture. So my goal with the protocol is not, oh, it's not going to be centralized. Git is very decentralized, but GitHub has a lot of the traffic. Email is very decentralized, but Gmail has a lot of the traffic. As long as you have something where it is very easy to switch providers, possibly without even the owner of the data knowing that they moved providers, merely because their provider stopped agreeing to a standard terms of service, and you had a rule that said only accept bids from people that have terms of service X, Y, or Q, that you can change the economics. So the Nash equilibrium of the storage provider is to behave well, rather than there will never be a centralized provider that holds most of the market.
I have to completely agree there, but I do want to quickly note that like the concern is more around the fact that, like, okay, once you start having the centralized party that has a lot of the storage, then they start getting a lot of power in the network to make decisions around the protocol and how things work, and they can try to build lock-in at that point. So for example, this is somewhat of a problem with Gmail, where like if you're trying to send an email to someone with Gmail and you try to run your own server, it's really, really hard because you have to like magically get them to accept your email and as not spam, and you're not going to be integrated with a lot of the features that they have for like displaying these nice like UIs around like plane tickets and stuff like that. So that's always the concern.
I agree strongly with Aaron, and actually want to push back, Stephen, is that if you can only forward your email through Gmail, then yes, you're screwed. But the point of what Aaron is saying with the decentralization is that even if all of my emails are predominantly stored on Gmail, as long as me and my friends have backup copies, I can always pull from them first. And when I want to email somebody, I can email directly from me to them or through any service provider, regardless of whether Gmail goes corrupt or tries to block. So Gmail in a proper decentralized network does not have governance of the protocol, who's connected to who.
This is true, but I think part of the pushback has to do with standards capture that can happen once a provider starts to really dominate things. And this also happened with Google on the web to some degree. They ended up forming their own standards committee, the WWG, as opposed to the W3C, for some complicated reasons, but they have a whole lot of control over the standards process. It's not a terrible situation, but it's definitely led to this exact dynamic occurring. And the only, to try to solve this, however, may be more effort than it's worth, because if the standards process ends up becoming just intolerably corrupted, then I guess you just have to have another protocol revolution, so to speak. But the counterweight of ensuring that provider centralization never occurs is very challenging. Having everybody have a little home server, for instance, would be a great goal. It's something that I spent a little bit of time this summer kind of probing at, and just frankly, there's a lot of blockers to something like that happening. So this may be something that you just have to take as much positive as you can and accept that, yeah, there's this chance of standards capture occurring, and if it does, we'll deal with it then.
I also want to note that this is actually already a problem, at least for me, with Gmail, that I don't use Gmail. But Gmail has like this cool feature where you can like accept a calendar invite. Google created this feature and like designed it as an open standard, but Google does not actually follow their own open standard here. So if you're trying to implement this in your own email client, good luck. You need to figure out how Gmail works and reverse engineer it.
Fascinating, Stephen, Paul, and others. Let's have a question from Nesky with Dave on deck. Please go ahead, Nesky.
Yeah. Hey guys. Thanks so much for the invite. Good to see everyone. I was in the audience and I heard a secret keyword, blockchain. Just kind of really wanted to come up on stage and so yeah, just kind of clarify. There's a lot of confusion around blockchain. Blockchain, in its sort of pure economic form, exists only on Bitcoin, right? And the reason being is because Bitcoin is the only one that can sustain it economically in a way that is decentralized and it cannot be corrupted by a state or any other actor. So when people mention blockchains in the context of anything else other than sort of global money, aka Bitcoin, then it does not really make sense. So just kind of wanted to make that comment. Like a bunch of people in the audience probably can benefit from that clarification.
I don't think so.
Well, it's not
I
it's
don't know.
not a question of opinion, sir. It's just a fact that no other quote unquote blockchain has a decentralization and has the economy that's built on top of it to sustain the decentralization. Like it's just a fact.
Where are those the majority of the miners located for Bitcoin?
Just queuing up the next speakers. So please go ahead and answer, and then we'll move it to Dave.
What I'm basically getting at with that is that Bitcoin has ended up having a fairly large centralizing effect on the miners through the mining pools. And I'm not really interested in getting into this debate, but I just don't want to give the impression that this is truly one way or another. There's no strong maxi opinion, in my opinion.
Thanks, Paul. Dave, go ahead with your question, and we'll take crypto next, and then Superboy on deck as well. Dave Hod, your question? You're on mute. Please go off mute. Let's move to Crypto Mozart then. And Dave Hod, please let us know if you're still there.
Knock him out. It's nonsense.
Okay, so Dave Hod is maybe there. Let's go to Superbolic Brad.
Hey guys, that's funny. That guy goes on stages all the time. He just plays a little clip of music and then leaves. It's a shtick. I don't think he's trolling. I think he's just doing it to be entertain himself or something. But I see him go on stage all the time, all kinds of different comedians.
Thanks. 30 more seconds for your question, please.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I'm here, but my Bluetooth's broken.
I'll let Dave go because he was up first.
Good.
Superboy, go ahead with your question, then we'll put Dave on deck. Thank you.
I just tweeted at all you guys. I just wanted to bring to your attention the Synonym project. It's kind of like what Aaron was talking about with the structure.
Just questions only. I'm sorry, Superboy. Please, no promotion of projects. Just questions if you have one. Let's move on to Dave if you're still there, and then.
Just trying to
thank
bring that
you.
to your attention.
Alicia, we'll put you on deck. Olazilla, we'll put you on deck.
Is it Dave that's going now?
Yes, Dave, go ahead. Olazilla, if you're there, please go ahead. I'll remove Dave and request if you still have a question, Dave.
See, this is why for talk radio it's so important to have screeners that make sure the other person's audio is fine before they start.
Great point, Mark. If we get there, we'll know we've arrived. Alex, you're on deck. Or if you have a question, go right ahead, Alex. Please
thanks,
go.
everyone. Just chiming in from deso.org. The question I had was, I heard the corollary to email given earlier, and the fact that, if you start to sort of congregate the data to one company, that it might not necessarily be an issue. The question I have is, in the social media realm, where there's these incentives to essentially hoard the data and then try to create an ad-driven business model around it that leads to things like, addiction and I think misinformation. I'm just curious how you all view the centralization of data in more of a social media space moving forward, and if that could be a problem.
So a clever thing is that if you take every Twitter or Facebook post and encrypt it with a public proof of work seed, then it becomes almost impossible for a large actor, the NSA, Twitter, Facebook, to actually decrypt and data mine the individual messages. However, as a user browsing on the website, it may only take a tenth of a second to decrypt each individual message you're seeing. And you might only have 100 messages on screen. And so there are techniques that you can do using proof of work based encryption, not for privacy, but just to deter mass monitoring of information.
That's actually a little bit tricky. Unfortunately, there's a pretty big asymmetry between like the processor on your phone and like the massive server farms that the NSA can have with a bunch of GPUs. So like honestly, the NSA can probably mimic every single phone and basically massively beat the amount of compute they have. So I'm a little bit skeptical of that kind of proof of work.
Let's move to LW. You are live, LW. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm, a beginner in the space, and my question is, what other use cases for decentralized data systems that prioritize, for example, privacy, like medical records, for example? Are there other examples in other like industries or areas that could be useful use cases in thinking about how to look at data and decentralized storage for social?
So I think at the moment, medical records are actually still pretty centralized in the way they're stored.
Well, I know
And
that's
part
kind
of
of
that
like,
is
sorry to interrupt. Could I just say why I said medical records in
sure.
particular? It's because the problem of centralization for the patient's care is actually, it's a disadvantage for the patient that there is these silos of data, basically, and that there is not a strong, secure way to decentralize that data.
I think our hope is that most things will move towards decentralization because of what you're saying. We don't want a single pharmaceutical company to have constant access to our information. We'd rather be able to provide our medical history to the one-off doctors that we personally trust. That's how I interpreted your question, and I full-heartedly agree. And I think that same concept applies to everything else. If I share my location with my mom, I don't really want Facebook watching at the same time. And so it's really a values-oriented approach to how things idealistically should work, regardless of any instant industries means to capture that value.
Yeah, I think the medical records example is actually a really good one because you're totally right. There's a huge, what you might call UX win to be had there. You have to go to every time you go to the doctor, you got to fill out the same paperwork again. If you have some kind of ongoing treatment, your doctors have to get in touch with each other to manually transfer these records. That could actually be a real problem for dealing with emergency care. So that's a really strong example of how this kind of stuff can be helpful. For the really broad cases, though, some of the stuff, it's like what Mark was saying, it would be just nice to have more confidentiality. It would be nice to feel like there's less centralization of opinion and control over the networks. And a lot of us, or at least I'll speak for myself, and Mark, you've mentioned this as well, some of the excitement just comes from being able to hack on these things again, to be able to be as an end user, getting to program against this giant social world that so far has been relatively locked down in that regard. So at least there's some fun to be had in the general case.
Great points, Paul. And that kind of reminded me of maybe another way to frame it as a threat model. When we don't have a global pandemic, a lot of people care about car safety and airplane safety more than germ swapping. But then as soon as the global pandemic happens, we all realize how important germ swapping is. So I think what a core kind of understanding of the decentralized community is saying, like, look, all of our data being on a centralized actor could turn into its own type of pandemic if they go down, if they become corrupt, if they distort things. And people are becoming more aware of that with all of the political havoc that's happening and how misinformation is flowing. So there's a lot of pieces to that, but I think the cry for decentralization is that voice in the desert saying, but what about germs, before a lot of people maybe realize it.
Arya, one last question.
Hi, so I wanted to circle back to my previous question, to which Aaron responded that the vision is basically to have storage providers in mass, like that provide mass storage even on these decentralized protocols. So I don't understand what's stopping from someone like Amazon or Google to get on these protocols and then again dominate the decentralized market. So it again is centralized if they are the majority players in this decentralized storage system.
An important piece is if your friends also have a copy of that data and they provide it to you for free, you never have to touch the larger farmer or miner in the network because you can bypass them entirely. They're just there for a backup.
Yeah, the important part is data portability and user choice. As long as you still have a choice to use the centralized system, then it's fine. Unfortunately, the centralized system captures the protocol or the specs, then you have problems. But as long as you have choice, you're fine.
I would still argue it's better for the computer to automatically choose to back up your data to your friends and to a couple different federated providers. And then, since you know that the federated providers are going to cost money to pull from or might corrupt or capture the market, the protocol just by default, like I said, gets the data from your neighbors, from your friends. And it's only in the failure case that we check the centralized provider. If we have to have users telling the computer which in every machine to back up the data to, I do agree with Arya, I believe, that's not much different than me choosing to upload it to Dropbox already and then having to again choose to upload it to Google Drive. For me, the point of decentralization is it just automatically backs up to all the ones that I can get access to and then pulls from the cheapest and closest ones, which are usually my friends.
Thanks. I know there's a few others who've requested to speak. We're running out of time. I'd like to invite Golda Velez to wrap and Manasi for any final comments, as well as Jay. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Robert, for moderating the Q&A. I think this was a phenomenal conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm pretty sure people in the audience did. And I think, we had a lot more questions than answers that we can answer in this 2-hour discussion. But I want to continue this conversation outside of Twitter space. And I think the Bluesky community Discord is a great place for that. I will let Golda wrap up the conversation. And just last reminder that next Friday we have another discussion around blockchain incentivized storage.
Thanks, Manasi. So thank you all for attending. We'll wrap up here. We will be publishing recordings of this talk, so you can look for those on the YouTube channel. And Friday's discussion will be hosted from this Bluesky Commons account, not the Bluesky account. So if you'd like to be notified, please follow this Bluesky Commons account. This is Robert Schwenker. Thank you all and have a nice day.
Actually, can I say a few closing words here?
Please.
Yeah, this is Jay from the Bluesky project. So I just want to also clarify kind of the difference here. So the Bluesky community and commons is kind of overarching big tent umbrella that, when Twitter started Bluesky, they put out all these requests, and all these great voices who are already doing a lot of work in decentralized social joined and spoke up. And so we wanted to just keep that going. And then, you know, the Bluesky project funded by funded by Twitter is actually, you know, it's still getting started because it's slow to work with, you know, lots of large institutions trying to like get things moving. And so we're still working kind of off on the side, but I think at this point, I'd consider ourselves as one part of the larger Bluesky ecosystem in the true spirit of decentralization. And so a lot of the ongoing community conversations are happening in the community Discord, which if you go to the website, blueskyweb.org, you can get a link to join that. And if you want to participate in future events or have a place to talk about particular projects you're really passionate about, meet other speakers, including the people who spoke here today, as well as people who've spoken on previous topics, go there and participate in that. And then that's a way to participate in just the broader decentralized ecosystem that we're building here. Awesome. All right. So I think maybe I will close the space now and see you guys next week for the incentivized storage conversation under the Bluesky Commons account if you're interested in that.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah. Thank you guys for coming.